So, David Attenborough, what animal do you think will become extinct next?
The cameras didn't catch the moment his heart broke, but witnesses say it was the kind of silence that echoes long after the room empties. Prince George stood there, barely taller than the waist of the adults around him, his small hands clenched and his eyes filled with tears. But this wasn't a child's tantrum. This was something deeper, more raw, a protective fire that erupted the moment he realized his sister was being used as a pawn in something much bigger than either of them. It began like any other royal day. Smiles, camera flashes, carefully choreographed grace. But behind the velvet curtains and polished crowns, a subtle battle was brewing, one that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with family. Queen Camilla, a figure always looming just behind the throne, had a plan. And young George, though barely old enough to understand the full weight of the crown he'd one day wear, saw enough to know something wasn't right. He saw the glances, heard the whispers, watched as Charlotte was moved from center stage to the shadows, and when it happened again, when he saw his sister's joy dimmed by quiet dismissal, he broke the silence with 4 words that shook the monarchy's walls. "That's my sister. This isn't just another palace drama. This is a story of loyalty over legacy, of innocence confronting power, of a boy who hadn't yet worn a crown but already understood what it meant to be a protector. What you're about to witness is more than just a moment. It's the unraveling of trust, the awakening of courage, and the beginning of a new royal chapter shaped not by tradition, but by truth." And it all started with George's tears. A normal royal day. To the outside world, it was another picture-perfect morning at Kensington Palace. The sun filtered gently through the grand windows, casting a golden glow over polished floors and polished smiles. The royal household was in full motion, staff gliding from room to room, final touches being made for a scheduled public appearance. Charlotte was giggling in her favorite pale blue dress, twirling before the mirror as a stylist adjusted her hair. George stood nearby, straightening his collar, quiet but observant. He always watched her with a brotherly attentiveness far beyond his years. From the outside looking in, it was the ideal royal family scene. William and Kate were preparing their children, poised and smiling. The cameras would soon arrive. The world would see what it always expected: beauty, order, unity. But even in that perfection, George felt something shift. He couldn't explain it. He only felt it, a heaviness in the room that didn't belong. He glanced toward the hallway and noticed something odd. Camilla had entered quietly, speaking in a hushed tone to one of the senior staff, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. George wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He wasn't even close enough to hear the entire exchange. But what caught his attention, what froze him in place, were the words he did catch. "She can't be the focus again. We need to redirect attention. Make sure the others are front and center." The tone was sharp, deliberate, and the look the staffer gave in return made George's chest tighten. He glanced at Charlotte, still twirling, still smiling, unaware that something was being arranged around her. Something she didn't deserve. He blinked, unsure if he'd misunderstood. Maybe he was being paranoid. But the feeling didn't go away. It clung to him like fog. The palace functioned on protocol and precision. Everyone had a place. But something about Camilla's words felt targeted, like this wasn't just about order. It was personal. George didn't know how to explain it, but his instincts kicked in. And even at 10 years old, he knew what it felt like when someone you loved was being quietly pushed aside. That afternoon, they were set to appear in the palace gardens for a charity event. Children from various branches of the family would be present, dressed in perfect pastel harmony, smiling for the press. George remained close to Charlotte the entire day, silently watching. Camilla's smile was there, her words polite, but her eyes lingered a second too long on the younger children of Charles's extended family, the ones she was often seen promoting in the press. George's eyes followed her every move. There had been moments before this, moments he had brushed off as coincidences. Times when Charlotte was placed at the far end of a row in family photos. Times when her name was conveniently left out of briefings. But this was different. This was deliberate. Camilla's plan, however subtle, had become clear to him. Distract attention, downplay Charlotte's visibility, highlight others. But why? George didn't know the full answer. He only knew the feeling, and it was wrong. Later that evening, he lay in bed, unable to sleep. His mind replayed every detail, every word, every glance. The palace halls had grown quiet, but in George's heart a storm had started. He stared at the ceiling, Charlotte's laugh still echoing in his ears. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to think that someone in the family, someone they called Granny Camilla, could be orchestrating such a quiet cruelty. But he had heard enough. He had seen enough. And though he was still just a boy, the future King of England felt a fire rise inside him, not as a prince, not as an heir, but as a brother. Something had changed, and from this moment on, George would never look at the palace the same way again. The pattern emerges. From that day onward, George could not unsee what he had seen. It haunted the quiet corners of his mind. A single overheard sentence had cracked something inside him, something that once believed adults always did the right thing. He had hoped it was a misunderstanding, a misheard moment of frustration. But as the days unfolded, the pattern began to emerge like a shadow growing longer each time the sun moved. Charlotte, as spirited and sweet as ever, remained unaware. She still called her Granny Camilla with hopeful eyes and offered smiles that expected kindness in return. But George noticed. He noticed how Camilla's responses were clipped, how her attention veered toward other children, the ones she always complimented in public, the ones she subtly guided to the forefront during royal gatherings. At a recent luncheon hosted at Clarence's house, George sat beside Charlotte as they were introduced to visiting dignitaries. Charlotte, eager and prepared, had practiced her greeting. But as they approached the front of the room, Camilla quietly rearranged the children, placing a younger cousin beside the guests while Charlotte was steered to the side. It was so seamless that no one else seemed to notice. But George did, and Charlotte did too, though she couldn't explain what she felt. Later that evening, as they sat reading on the carpet in their playroom, she looked at him and asked in a whisper, "Did I do something wrong? Granny Camilla didn't want me in the picture." Her eyes were wide, searching for an answer. George's heart tightened. He shook his head, managing a small smile, but he didn't know what to say. At 10, George wasn't supposed to carry secrets. He wasn't meant to observe politics disguised as family affection, but there was no mistaking it now. He began to keep mental notes, collecting each subtle slight like puzzle pieces he couldn't yet fit together. Birthday cards from Camilla that arrived late or not at all. Compliments that never extended to Charlotte. Instructions whispered to staff that seemed to echo the same message: reduce her presence. One morning, George overheard Camilla in conversation again, this time by the drawing room entrance. She said the words slowly, carefully, to a senior aide. "It's important we make room for the right grandchildren, the ones who reflect the crown." George stopped in his tracks, his hands clenched at his sides. What did that mean? What did it say about Charlotte? About him? That evening, the weight of it all sat heavy on his chest. At the dinner table, he watched Charlotte laughing over mashed potatoes, unaware of the quiet erasure happening around her. And for the first time, George felt something he had never associated with royalty: helplessness. He wanted to tell someone, to tell his parents, but how could he? What would he even say? That their step-grandmother seemed to be subtly cutting Charlotte out of the family's public life? That she seemed to be favoring children with no direct claim to the throne? It sounded like a child's jealousy, or worse, an accusation without proof. But the evidence was building, and so was George's anger. He no longer viewed Camilla solely as a royal figure. He saw her as someone quietly trying to shift the future, to rearrange the story being told to the public, one photo, one interaction at a time. Charlotte, bright and full of promise, was being treated as expendable. George's heart burned with quiet rage. He knew something had to be done. He wasn't just Charlotte's big brother anymore. He was her only shield in a palace filled with silken smiles and silent strategies. And on that realization, George made a decision. He would no longer stay silent, even if it meant breaking the invisible rules that kept the palace running smoothly, even if it meant standing alone. The breaking point. The sun shone brightly over the royal gardens as the annual spring gala unfolded. It was one of the most publicized events of the year, a day when cameras were welcome and the royal children were gently ushered into the spotlight. For Charlotte, it was a day of excitement. She loved dressing up, especially when her mother helped her pick the dress. Today, she wore a soft pink frock adorned with delicate floral embroidery and a silver hairband that made her look like she had stepped out of a fairy tale. George watched her twirl in front of the mirror before they stepped out. He smiled, but inside, his mind was busy. The words he had overheard from Camilla days earlier still rang in his ears. He didn't want to believe them, but something in his gut told him to pay attention, and that instinct would be proven right within the hour. As the family gathered for the traditional photo lineup, aides directed the children into position. Camilla appeared calm, poised, and unusually hands-on. She moved among the group like a hostess arranging a dinner table. George stood tall beside Charlotte, refusing to break his gaze. Then it happened. With a subtle motion, Camilla leaned down and touched Charlotte's shoulder. "Let's have you just over here," she said with a tight smile, guiding her 2 steps behind the others. George saw it clearly. It wasn't a repositioning, it was a removal. She had gently placed Charlotte where the cameras would barely catch her. Charlotte looked up, confused. She smiled, unsure of whether she was doing something wrong. She tried stepping forward again, but Camilla's hand stopped her. Another child, one of Camilla's favored step-grandchildren, was now front and center. George's pulse quickened. His chest tightened. No one else seemed to notice. The photographer lifted the camera, and then George did something unthinkable. He stepped forward. His small voice, cracked with rising emotion, rang out across the lawn. "That's my sister." Everything stopped. The clicking of the camera ceased. Conversations trailed off. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Every head turned to the 10-year-old prince standing in front of the royal line, eyes bright with tears, fists clenched at his sides. Camilla blinked, clearly taken aback. For a moment she didn't speak. William and Kate, positioned a few feet away, turned swiftly at the sound. George didn't flinch. His eyes didn't leave Camilla's. It wasn't defiance. It was heartbreak. Charlotte stood frozen, her expression caught between embarrassment and relief. Her lip quivered, unsure whether to run or hold her ground. In that moment, the carefully rehearsed elegance of royalty collapsed under the weight of a child's honesty. George had seen enough, felt enough, and he had broken the invisible rule, never confronting what must be concealed. But George didn't care. He didn't understand politics. He didn't grasp the palace hierarchy. He just knew someone was hurting his sister, and he couldn't stay quiet anymore. The silence that followed his words would echo far beyond the garden walls. George's emotional breakdown. The silence didn't last. The moment George's words cut through the air, the fragile balance of royal composure shattered. Camilla took a step back, her mouth slightly parted, trying to assess the situation. But George wasn't done. His voice, now shaking and unfiltered, rose again. "Why are you being mean to Charlotte?" he asked, his eyes locked on hers. "She didn't do anything wrong." He was crying now, not just soft tears, but the kind that come from a place too deep for words. His shoulders trembled, his lip quivered. He looked like every child who had ever watched someone they loved be hurt by people who pretended to care. Across the garden, journalists lowered their cameras. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. This wasn't a photo op anymore, it was a reckoning. Charlotte stepped forward and clung to George, her arms wrapped around him tightly as if she too understood that something irreversible had just taken place. Her head rested against his chest, and George, still sobbing, hugged her back without hesitation. At the edge of the scene, Kate's hand flew to her mouth. William moved quickly, instinctively toward his children. His protective instincts had been sharpened by years of watching his mother suffer under the public eye. This moment hit him like a freight train. Camilla tried to speak. "George, I didn't..." But William's voice cut her off as he stepped between them. "Enough!" It wasn't loud, but it was final. George looked up at his father, unsure what would happen next. But William knelt beside him, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "You were right to speak." George's tears kept falling, but now there was a flicker of relief. Charlotte looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you." "I'll always protect you," he said through tears. And in that moment, the palace protocol lay in ruins, replaced by something far more powerful: love, truth, and the courage of a 10-year-old boy who refused to stay silent. Palace in crisis. The gala ended without a closing speech. Guests were quietly ushered back to their cars. The press officers went into overdrive, frantically texting and calling to contain what they knew was coming. No statement could undo what hundreds of eyes had witnessed. Prince George crying in front of cameras, standing up for his sister, and breaking the image of perfect unity the palace had carefully crafted. Back inside the palace, the Wales family retreated into a private room. George was still quiet, recovering from the surge of emotions. Charlotte held his hand as though letting go would unravel the moment. Kate knelt in front of them, brushing tears from George's cheek. William stood by the door, eyes burning with a quiet storm. Then George spoke. He told them everything about the overheard conversations, the subtle moves to diminish Charlotte, the repeated patterns of favoritism. As he recounted the details, his parents sat in silence, taking in every word. George's voice never rose, but each sentence hit with force. When he finished, he looked down, afraid he'd crossed some invisible line. But William stepped forward and gently lifted George's chin. "You were brave," he said. "You protected your sister and you told the truth. That's what leaders do." Kate hugged him tightly, whispering, "We're proud of you." Meanwhile, elsewhere in the palace, Camilla was already spinning her version of events. She claimed it was a misunderstanding, that George had misinterpreted things, but no one was listening the same way anymore. William called a private meeting with Charles and laid it bare. "No more. From now on, our children will not be alone with her." Charles didn't argue. That one decision marked the beginning of a quiet divide. Behind closed doors, the monarchy had been shaken, and it had all begun with a brother's tears and the courage to call out the silence. The royal schism. In the days that followed, the royal residences took on a tension that even the most seasoned aides struggled to manage. Camilla was visibly absent from multiple engagements. When questioned by reporters, the palace issued carefully worded statements about private family time and adjustments in scheduling. But behind those walls, the fracture was undeniable. George returned to his usual routine, but something in him had changed. He walked taller, not with arrogance, but with quiet responsibility. Every glance toward Charlotte came with unspoken reassurance. He had stepped into a role far earlier than anyone expected, not as heir to the throne, but as her shield. Camilla, meanwhile, found herself increasingly isolated. Where once she had enjoyed soft influence in arranging the children's appearances, she was now met with firm resistance. Kate stopped responding to her inquiries directly. William was cordial but distant. The rift had taken form. King Charles was caught in the middle. Publicly, he maintained an image of composure, but behind closed doors, he faced an impossible storm. He loved his wife, but his loyalty to William and, more importantly, to his grandchildren was non-negotiable. Tensions erupted in a private meeting where William reportedly said, "My son spoke the truth. If we don't protect him now, we fail as parents." Charles didn't argue. The media began picking up on the subtle shift. Fewer family photos included Camilla alongside the children. George and Charlotte appeared exclusively with their parents, while body language experts on news programs speculated on what was really going on behind the smiles. Though the palace refused to confirm anything, the change was visible. George became more introspective. He spent long hours reading in quiet corners of the palace, occasionally looking out windows as if trying to understand the weight of what had happened. He had acted on instinct, but now he carried the aftermath. At night, he sometimes whispered to Charlotte to make sure she was okay. She would nod and whisper back, "Because of you, I am." For William and Kate, the incident became a turning point in their parenting. William often thought about his mother, Diana. He remembered how she had fought to protect him from the system that now sought to mold his own children. He realized now that the spirit of that fight had passed to George, and for Kate, the moment reminded her of why she had insisted on raising her children with a sense of normalcy, compassion, and courage. She watched George closely, not out of fear, but in awe of his sensitivity. He had felt the injustice and reacted not with calculation, but with heart. Camilla attempted to smooth things over behind the scenes. She sent gifts, called occasionally to ask about the children, but her efforts were received with polite distance. She had underestimated George, and more importantly, the family unity that surrounded him. The damage was done. Where there was once quiet tolerance, there was now a line. George had forced the family to see what had long been veiled behind etiquette and tradition. This wasn't rebellion, it was a revelation. The new legacy. Months passed, but the shift remained. Events were now carefully managed. George and Charlotte's presence was always under the watchful eye of their parents. The children smiled for cameras, waved during parades, but a new awareness lingered behind their expressions, especially George's. He had not forgotten. The royal family may have returned to public grace, but internally, a new order had quietly been set. George's act had sparked a reckoning, one that realigned priorities. He was no longer treated as just a child who would one day lead. He was seen as a voice that already carried weight. Charlotte, now more confident, leaned on her brother in subtle ways. She would glance toward him before interviews or reach for his hand during formal walks, and George responded with quiet strength, always by her side. Their bond deepened, not just from shared blood, but from shared battles. William and Kate used the moment to reinforce what they had always believed, that their children should never be pawns in royal politics, that love, truth, and protection mattered more than protocol. Diana's presence loomed gently over everything. Her legacy of love and defiance had taken root in her grandson. Public sentiment began to shift, too. Stories of George's stand trickled out from sources close to the palace. He was praised for his empathy, his courage, The media, once hungry for scandal, now painted a picture of a future king shaped not by entitlement but by integrity. Camilla's public image remained intact, but within the family her reach had been curtailed. She had lost something intangible but vital: trust. George, still young, didn't fully grasp the scale of what he had changed, but those around him did. The monarchy had survived many storms, but this one had come not from outside criticism or public scandal, but from a child's heart. A boy who looked at injustice and, rather than bowing to it, chose to speak. The new legacy had begun, not just for George, but for the future of the crown.